Hello and welcome to Birth Time, the podcast. Following the success of our world-renowned and international award-winning film, Birth Time, the documentary, we are coming back together to explore a wide variety of topics around pregnancy, birth and postpartum. As a way of exploring topics in great depth, we will be covering one topic over several episodes, bringing you up-to-date evidence-based information from academics, practitioners and birth workers, as well as stories and lived experiences from birthing women and people and their families. We will also have interludes with people we interviewed in Birth Time the documentary, finding out where life has taken them since the creation of the film. Join your hosts, home birth midwife Jo Hunter and doula and birth photographer Jerusha Sutton, as we delve deep into the world of growing and birthing babies. Welcome back to Birth Time, the podcast. This is our next episode in our birth trauma series, series 1. And today we are very lucky to have the incredible Hazel Keedle with us. Dr Hazel Keedle is a senior lecturer of midwifery and director of academic midwifery programs at the School of Nursing and Midwifery, Western Sydney University. Hazel has experience as a clinician in nursing and midwifery, educator and researcher. Her research interests are vaginal birth after caesarean, birth trauma, and maternity experiences, which she explores primarily using feminist mixed methodologies. Dr. Keedle is the author of the book, Birth After Caesarean, Your Journey to a Better Birth, which is based on her PhD findings. Dr. Keedle is also lead researcher on the largest Australian maternity experiences survey, the Birth Experience Study, otherwise known as the BEST study, and the BEST International Collaboration. All of those things which we'll explore today. Hazel, it's so lovely to have you on. Welcome.
Well, it's great to be here.
Hazel, I was reflecting this morning on when we first met. And do you know, it was almost 20 years ago.
Such a long time.
I know. Like, we were both student midwives. We were at different universities. And we were both living in the Blue Mountains, and I was running a postnatal group in my home. And you had just finished a baby massage course.
Yeah.
And you came along and hosted a baby massage session. I remember it being very, very gorgeous with all the little bubbers.
Yeah.
And then we were both private midwives in the Blue Mountains. It was well before the 2-midwife rule came into effect. But I know that we absolutely supported each other's caseloads. And I know that you went to several of my clients' births and I went to several of yours.
Yeah, you did. All the way out in the Central West sometimes.
I know, that's right. Orange. Yeah, I remember. Anyway, here we are. A lot has gone on in those 20 years.
Yeah.
We know that you have varied special interests in the academic world around birth, but today we'd really like to focus in on birth trauma, but more specifically the birth experience study or the BEST study, as Rue said. We'd like to talk about its results and how they've informed the New South Wales Parliamentary Inquiry into birth trauma. So just before we do that, just a little bit of background first. So after the creation of Birth Time, the documentary, and weeks before we headed out on our Q&A tour around Australia, we were trying to work out ways that we could engage the masses and ignite people's passion. So the film was and is educational, but we wanted something that those that saw the film and felt compelled could do to affect change. So at the time, we created a campaign called Breaking the Birth Silence, which had different layers of involvement, but we were acutely aware that there was an opportunity for women to have a voice and share their experiences, but in turn to gather information about women's birth experiences. So I chatted with Hannah, pondered the idea of some sort of study that people could engage with. Enter the incredible you. You just completed your PhD.
Yep.
And absolutely ran with this idea, and it is bigger and better than anything that we ever imagined, Hazel. And that's where we stepped out and you completely ran with it. So can you first talk up about the creation of the BEST study? I know there were many consumer groups involved in its creation. How on earth did you engage so many organisations, create a survey and a QR code, and get the study through ethics just within it was literally weeks before we headed off on tour? Can you just speak about that with us?
It's funny because I work with research groups now on the international side, and they take months and months and months to do it. And they're like, did it take this long? And I'm like, oh, no, we really didn't take that long. So yeah, you're right. You had a chat with Hannah, and I know her original response was like, "There's no way we can get that done in that time frame." But she's my colleague, my friend, and was also my supervisor for both my master's and my PhD. And so she knew exactly where I was at, that I had my PhD was under examination. I needed a new project to work on. And she suggested, well, would you do it? So I was, it was a good time of year in a way for academia, because it was January. And in January, we don't have, I don't teach in that semester of January, in summer semester. So it's often a bit of a downtime anyway. And it's a time that we try and do a lot of research writing, or I do anyway. Other people go on holiday, but I just like to write. So it was opportunistic in that way as well. And also Hannah and I had done quite a lot of surveys together. You know, we were right in the thick of the birth and the time of COVID study, where we had almost every week had Zoom meetings that we called the wine and cheese meeting. There was never any wine or cheese, but it was a Friday night, so we tried to make it feel like we had a life. And we would do survey stuff and create all these longitudinal surveys that are nearly finished actually, in the birth and time of COVID study. So we had this kind of collection of survey questions that we could kind of pull together, and that's kind of where I started. Now, thanks to a few contacts that I had, but mainly contacts through Hannah, she did have contacts with all these different consumer organizations. And I've done training in co-design. So I was very passionate about it. And I said, well, let's do this from the very beginning with the co-design. So we did send out emails. I did, Hannah did. And people were saying yes. So we ended up with this group of consumer representatives from about 10 different consumer organizations, you guys included. And they were kind of our core to check. And they were involved in every single step, in the fact that they got sent the survey that we put together, and we asked for them for feedback on that survey, and nothing got removed, but questions got added, and other things got added, like a list of things. There would be different things that were added on the different items added to the list. The very important question about obstetric violence got added. We didn't have that originally, but that came from the Human Rights and Childbirth team, Bashi, who said, can we put that question in? So we were like, all right, then let's put that in. And it ended up with 133 questions, and 26 of them as open text questions as well, so women could really share that stories. So that's that mixed methodologies that I like to do so much. We could get all the data and all the numbers, but we really need to build that around what women are saying about it. So yeah, it was pretty crazy to get it done that quick. And even when we sent it to ethics, we were looking at the ethics timeline, and they had one that the next meeting was the first one was in January for the year. So we had to get everything in on time, and the survey in on time, because usually you get things into ethics and then you send them the survey afterwards, but we knew we wouldn't have time to do that. So we just put everything in at once, and thankfully there was no big hiccups. And I think and then you guys helped by creating postcards, which we just provided a QR code, and they were already imprinted. And I just had the survey on, like not live. So I literally just had to press the button to make it live. It was all just sitting there waiting. So if you did the QR code, it would just send you to a thing that said, this is not currently active. But just as soon as I could press live, then it was available. And so we were able to do that as soon as we got ethics through. So it was a crazy month, but your passion and your want for women to have a voice has had a bigger impact than I could have ever imagined.
So exciting. So it's just, yeah, I mean, so many years and so many people have been, involved into this point. Like really, it's been a massive group effort. So can you speak to, has the findings come out of that study? Is the key findings that
they keep coming out? So we were planning on putting a formal final report together, and we even had a little co-design team to help with that. But time has run away with us for that one. And so I need to figure out whether we're going to do this final report. But a lot of it came out. We kind of put together some of that for our submission for the birth trauma inquiry. So there is a lot of information in there. But then we've had academic papers. So we've had 5 academic papers published on different aspects of the survey or different aspects of the findings. And we've got 2 under review at the moment, and there's others in creation. So I'm writing a really exciting one about what women say about birth plans. So that's been written at the moment, and there's other aspects to it. Plus now we've got papers that we're working on from the international data as well. So there's not like because it covers such a wide area, we haven't got one paper that tells you all the findings, because we wouldn't fit the word count in. So instead we focus on different areas, and some papers have come to fruition, some we've had to park and focus on others.
So we know it's called the biggest survey into maternity services in Australia.
But it's purely because of the numbers. I mean, that was never planned, and certainly doesn't have the funding for it. Because
so what were the numbers, Hazel?
So we ended up with over 12,000 women access the survey, and 8,804 is the number we go on, because that was the number that reached 75% or more. And often surveys will go on, say, 50% or more, but we actually found a large majority did engage all the way through to 70% or more. So yeah, we 8,804. And when we look at, and the reason I kind of coined the largest Australian survey, one, because it is, but also when we look at the other national surveys that have been done out there in other countries, such as the Listening to Mothers survey in the US, and ones in the UK and other places, our numbers are often double what they get anyway, and they're like their population compared to ours. I mean, the UK's got double our population. So to think that we were able to get more in that frame than they were on some of their national ones, shows that we did something right in the design of it. There was something about it that women were happy to keep going and keep doing, but then also the way that we put it out there, the way that we shared it, we disseminated the survey, and I'm not someone who likes to hide our benefits or what we've learned, so we even wrote a paper on how we did that, so how we use social media, and there's a whole paper on, and how we did co-design, one, because then when you're writing the other papers, you can just go look at this paper, look at this, like we can refer to that one, but also so that we can be transparent on how we were able to harness the benefits of social media and get so many women being part of it.
Amazing. So around the study, it was translated into several different languages. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Can you just speak to that? How did that work?
Yeah, so when we, from our co-design team, so from all those different maternity organisations, one of the feedback when they were looking at the survey was, well, this is great, but it's only in English, and this is only, going to be able to get English-speaking people to do the survey, which was obvious. Yep, that's true. But I said, well, that would be great. I'm happy to do it in other languages, but we literally have no money for that. So then there came the co-design way of raising money as well. And at our school, we had a partnership grant available. So if we could raise from a partner, or in this case, multiple partners, which I must say was a nightmare for our admin side here at the uni, but they lived with it. So if we could make a minimum amount, our university would match it. And these aren't massive. You can get massive partnership grants, but this was the school-based one, quite small. So I went back to the team and said, well, if you can put some money in, or if all of you can put some money in, we can get to this amount, then we can match it. And then we can use that money, a large majority of that money, towards translating it. So we did, and everyone did it in different ways. Some people were able to put a small amount in, some people gave more. And then as we were getting to the end, we were a couple of thousand short what we needed. And I had seen, thanks to Birth Time, I had seen that there was a company that was hosting a morning tea and film showing of Birth Time. And, I'd seen that on your social media pages, and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. I know this company, they're Australian, they're very midwifery centered. It's nothing to do with feeding issues that could be there for, thinking of who we've got to work with. And so I approached them and I said, I know you guys are a small company, but, if you'd like to support a research project, this has come from Birth Time, and would you be interested? And they gave double the amount that I asked for. So that put us over the amount and they actually created an award for it. So their founder had passed away quite suddenly, and they wanted to have a research award in his name. And so they created that research award, and they awarded it to us for well, we got it the first year for that, but then they gave it to us the second year as well. So that was really generous of them. And that meant we could match it. So then suddenly we had the money to be able to get it translated, but not enough to get it professionally translated. Because when I then did go and have a look at how to get it professionally translated, I was like, oh my God, we can't do that. But I'm not one to take no for an answer. So I then came up with a different idea, and it was lockdown again. So being 2021, a lot of people are out of work, especially migrant women. So I put some calls out, and I went to migrant resource centres, and I said, do you have anyone that could speak in this language and could translate and has got experience of maternity, so they would understand the language that we need it to be put into? Would they do it? And they could earn, it wasn't much, it was like $500 per one, but for someone who was out of work, that could be really quite helpful. So I had students that were struggling. I had a woman, oh, she was so beautiful. She had been working she was a single mum working in hospitality, had been, wasn't currently working, just saw this as a really great opportunity. And so it didn't go to a big company that was, using most of that for their profit. It purely went out to women who were from the migrant community as well. So that was something that was really important and held to the ethos of the foundations of what we really wanted from the birth experience study, was to get that voice. And then they actually became part of my cultural steering group, because they would often come back to me. I know the lady, the young woman who did the simplified Chinese translation, she said, but Hazel, you have no questions here about translation and using interpreting services. I'm like, well, no, we didn't. That's right. So we added them. And so like they would help us with, and one of the students who did the Arabic, it was hilarious. It was a whole family affair, because she learned Arabic. She's Australian born, second generation. So she learned Arabic at school, wasn't as fluent as she originally said she was, but her family was. So I do these Zoom meetings with her, and there'd be her father, her mother, aunties, and they'd all be working out what the right word should be. The father sometimes like, I don't know.
Wow,
Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's fantastic. I didn't know that's how you got about doing that. That is just amazing.
I know, I don't do things in a normal, boring way.
That's a beautiful story. I think it's probably appropriate for us to mention that company was Kiara, yes?
Yes, Kiara.
I would really like to acknowledge them, because they have been long-term supporters of certainly the home birth community and different, great things. So that it is a company who have been very aligned with on the good side of birth for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's completely heads up to Kiara, because they have continued to support birth experience study, and are keen and passionate about all the work that we do as well. So yeah,
they are.
Hey there, Zoe Naylor here from the Birth Time team. If you've seen Birth Time the documentary and loved it, why not gift the film to help educate and inspire other women and people from around the world? Just head to the birchtime.world shop, where you can buy a digital gift card and send it online to anyone you like. It's a brilliant way to help spread the message and be part of the movement. Now it's back to the podcast.
So Hazel, in reference to, this being our birth trauma series, can we look at the results? And these were some of the very early results, weren't they, that you got out of the study in terms of birth trauma and obstetric violence? Can we hear to what you found in those areas?
Yep, absolutely. So because the obstetric violence question, we hadn't asked that before, I was particularly intrigued on what were the findings were for that. So when we closed it in the December of 2021, by January, we were looking at the obstetric violence comments and data. So we found that more than 1 in 10 women said yes or maybe, because we did have a maybe in there just in case women weren't sure, and there was a definition of it as well. And so, yeah, more than 1 in 10 said yes or maybe to experiencing obstetric violence. And then there was 626 written comments, because once they said yes or maybe, they then got the opportunity to, you know, can you tell us more about that? And they did. And so we then decided to do a content analysis, which is I'm going to use to thematically analyze all the different comments and categorize them. And we started that with a research assistant, which is Warren, my husband, and he went through all the comments one by one, which watching him go through that was actually quite full on, you know, because he's been an RA for me for a little while, but this was the first one that he really dived into those really awful comments. So he did a first level of analysis and started categorizing them, and then I did a second level, and then we wrote the paper. So the paper is just myself, Warren, and Hannah, and so Hannah was then part of that as well. And we found that there was these three main categories of I felt dehumanized, I felt powerless, and I felt violated. What we did when the birth trauma, so we published that paper, and that came out in December 2022. Can
I just butt in there for a minute? The definition of obstetric violence, you said there was a definition, and I think it's probably important to note here that it's not just about obstetricians.
No, absolutely, yes. So obstetric violence is quite, in the definition, we had a slight verb issue, but it was around any dehumanizing or violent treatment that you received from a healthcare provider. So obstetric violence is a term that is recognized by the United Nations and by the EU now. The EU just put out a really interesting report on obstetric violence across the European Union. And it came originally from South America, where the term obstetrica is used in a lot of the titles of different healthcare providers. So it's not just about obstetricians, but in English-speaking countries, often the obstetricians get a bit upset because they think it's about obstetricians only and not across all maternity care clinicians. But it can be any maternity care clinician from pre-pregnancy, so like IVF type areas as well, so pregnancy all the way through to post-birth, and so not just during labour and birth either. And that's certainly what we found from women's comments, and meaning anyone. So it could be a midwife, a nurse, a doctor, a sonographer, a physio. It could be anyone in that space. And we use that term. We stick to that term, even though there is a discourse around not using the term, because one of the arguments is that, well, if we use that term, it sounds like people are, healthcare providers are out there meaning to do harm. And then they get really upset about it. And, I refer to the work by Camilla Pickles, who's a bioethicist from the UK and is actually on our UK birth experience study team, which is really exciting. And she's wrote some amazing discussion papers around the actual term of it as well. And kind of using some of her wording, although it may, if we use different terminology, it may soften the blow for healthcare providers. If we say, oh, it was mistreatment or a bit of disrespect, but it actually silences the women who experienced it, because there's so much power in the name and so much power in identifying what actually happened to you. I think it's very parallel with how we used to have, we didn't really used to use the terminology sexual assault. We would have rape or nothing. So if you'd had an assault happen to you that was sexual in nature, but not had been raped, you often didn't have that language to be able to identify what had happened. And then when the term sexual assault was more commonly used, I think a lot of women could go, okay, that is what happened to me, and that was still wrong. And now I know that it was wrong because I've got this terminology and I can move through that. Certainly I've seen that in a massive way with obstetric violence. So for women to actually go, okay, that's the term, that's what happened to me, I've now got an understanding of that, then that can actually bring action, but it can also bring healing. Like if you're in this limbo land of never really being able to identify what happened to you, then it really doesn't bring that healing. And I think I really saw this with a dear midwife friend of mine who's retired, and we were seeing each other at a lot of different conferences, and she had, I think it was 4 Caesareans during her birthing time, and then had her whole midwifery career. And she read the paper, the obstetric violence paper, when it came out, and had a big epiphany and realized that that's the terminology of what happened to her in her experiences. She then identified that. She then went to therapy. She then worked her way through that therapy and then got trained in that therapy so she can help other women now. So it got so much power, and she'd retired. So it's not as if she'd just had that experience. She'd lived with that her entire life, not really knowing what that terminology is. So I think for those that get upset about the term, like, get over it. It's a term. It's a recognised term by the United Nations, by the EU. Do you think your college, which is Australian, is as big as them? No, they're using the term. We need to use the term. It's actually more powerful for women. If you don't like it, then don't do it.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
We did ask women about birth trauma, and we found 28% of women said yes to birth trauma. Then there were about 3,000 comments on that one, and we're about halfway through those comments. That one's had to be parked a little bit. But what we have done instead for the birth trauma inquiry, when we put together our birth experience study submission for that, is we really did a deep dive into birth trauma, and that's kind of what I've been presenting a lot around the place. And although our submission is not a peer-reviewed journal article, but it is a public available document. So because of that, we can, we verified our results, and I can talk to them. And what we found, although there was 28% of women that experienced birth trauma, 1 in 10 who experienced obstetric violence, it changed, either increased or decreased, by a number of factors. And those factors that we looked at, because they were related to the terms of reference of the inquiry, was induction of labour versus spontaneous. And so it went up about 10%, just if you were having an induction of labour. By mode of birth, massively. So a caesarean during labour, this is off the top of my head now, it's something like 55%. Instrumental birth, around the same, in the mid-50s. Caesarean before labour kept it the same at 28%. So that's still nothing to be great about. That's still nothing to be excited about, really. It kept it the same. The only one that decreased it down to 15% was vaginal birth. So when we're looking at that rhetoric of, well, it doesn't matter about induction, doesn't matter what it does, because that, alongside that cascade of trauma, a cascade of intervention that we know so well, once you start one intervention, you have another and another and another and another, and it keeps taking you down that path. Is we have to recognise, and our study showed this, that alongside is that cascade of intervention. And that starts with induction as well. Actually, we all know it starts a little bit further back when they start having that conversation about induction and everything else. It's impacted the minute you choose your healthcare provider or whatever. But that once you start those interventions, you've got that cascade of trauma going alongside. And I really want midwives and women to be thinking about that it's not just about the cascade of intervention. You've got to think the more that we do to women, the more trauma they could be experiencing. So that was mode of birth. Then we looked at things like models of care. So was it impacted by different models of care? And it was. Now, because our numbers were so large, one of the things I was very excited about is that we didn't have to lump all continuity of care with a midwife in the same box. I did for my PhD because my numbers weren't quite so big. But so I had continuity of care with a midwife as one of the factors. But in the birth experience study, because our numbers were big, we could actually pull out privately practicing midwives. We looked at group practice midwives, and then private obstetricians. We looked at GP shared care, and we put together standard care, which is standard fragmented care. And in the fragmented models, which were the standard and the GP, because they might be with their GP for a while, but then they just get helicoptered into the fragmented model for the rest of the pregnancy. They were higher birth trauma and obstetric violence rates than the norm. I can't remember what those numbers were off the top of my head. But as you went into continuity, they all became lower than the standard 1 in 10 and 28%. But not all continuity was the same. It was low with private obstetricians, but then it was low with MGP, and then it was like lower again with privately practicing midwives. And that was dramatic, like a dramatic decrease with privately practicing midwives having the lowest rates of birth trauma and obstetric violence. Then we looked at, well, if we look at mode of birth, we know that vaginal birth is the only one that decreased birth trauma rates. How about we superimpose that with, or cross-reference that with models of care? And as you can imagine, there was all these different caesarean rates, but vaginal birth rate, knowing that decreased it, that was in the high 80s with privately practicing midwives. It was around about the 50s, 60s, 70s maybe for MGP, and the lowest with private obstetricians. So if we want to really look at lowering obstetric violence and birth trauma, then we want to look at a privately practicing midwife or MGP and not be induced and not have the interventions, and actually say vaginal birth actually does matter, because it has an impact on how you feel afterwards as well, how you process that. The other thing we looked at was different groups of women. So birth trauma and obstetric violence increased for First Nations women, increased for culturally and linguistically diverse women, for young mums. That was the biggest increase, to be honest, for young mums aged 24 years and younger. And I also worked with a psychology honours student who looked at the outcomes for women who in our survey said they had experienced intimate partner violence at some point in their life, not just in the previous year, which is how we often ask it in the antenatal screening, but any time during their life. And they also had higher rates of birth trauma and obstetric violence. So they're coming in traumatized, and we're sending them out even more traumatized. So that's all available on the public record through our birth trauma report. But that's kind of how we did a really big deep dive into it. And we've got more stuff coming out with the Netherlands data. So we're looking at, they're doing logistical regressions with our data and the Netherlands data to look at what kind of things also factor it in with more with better statistics, better trained people working on it, who are really like number crunching at the moment. So I haven't quite seen what those results are yet.
Wow, it's amazing, Hazel.
It's so significant, isn't it? It's so detailed and significant. It's incredible.
There's so many things that you can pull out of. I mean, I guess it was such a big survey, but with so many people getting involved in filling it out, and then all the different avenues you can take from that data, it's just extraordinary, really.
Yeah. And we still are, like, there's still so much more we're looking at, but I guess the birth trauma inquiry report or submission meant we could really focus in on that. And I think, we often talk about the benefits of continuity of care with a midwife. We know them. We've got an updated Cochrane review by Sandel just a couple of months ago. And then we always, we tend to talk about all the morbidity and mortality benefits, how it's going to be physically better. And then we'll just add, and women are happier, or women have higher satisfaction rates. But I actually think we need to be, we don't have the same kind of data as it's not a randomized controlled trial. But, with our large amount of data, and this will be, interesting when we get the whole of the international cohort too, is that I think we can also say, not only does continuity of care help with all these other physical issues, but it also protects against trauma and violence. And that's gold. Like, that's so gold. Like, that's something we've really got to hold on to and go, it's not just about whether or not you had these types of births or you had these types of outcomes, which we in the health profession hold up as really high. Did she have a bleed? Did she have these? They seem more important to us than did she feel traumatized? Is she actually able to care for her child? Is she at more risk of having mental health issues now because of going through trauma? Like, I think that is so much more important. And certainly I'm very excited that our study has been able to shine a light on that and looking at really putting that at the focus.
Absolutely.
So let's move on to the New South Wales Parliamentary Inquiry into birth trauma. So those that are listening in that don't know, there has been a parliamentary inquiry into birth trauma, which has had, how many hearings were there, Hazel?
There were 6 hearings. There were over 4,000 submissions from women, professionals and organisations and charities. So there was a lot of submissions, the largest they've ever seen, really, with this type of inquiry. And then they had 6 hearing days in Sydney, Wollongong and Wagga.
Yeah, okay. And so there's a select committee that of different MPs that basically come together, sit down, listen to everybody that's coming in, speaking their truth and sitting in on the hearings. And then they all get together and write recommendations. So what we know last week is that they've tabled 43 recommendations for the government, and the government has 3 months to look at those and answer to them. Is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay. Can you speak to us a little bit about how you feel about the recommendations that have been put forward, and maybe some of the really good things that have been put forward and some of the things that have fallen short?
I think we've got to be very proud of the recommendations that have been put forward. The process was robust, and often when we live in this space, I mean, we were talking before, Jo, that we've known each other for over 20 years, and you had been a doula for many years before that, and like we've lived and breathed this stuff and cared for women, so we know this information really well, and we could sit down together and come up with recommendations, right? And obviously we've got our own lenses that we see it through, but these were people that were not in maternity care, and I think the recommendations that have come out, like we can pick at some, and we can say, we can complain about some, but if this is what a group of people who may have never had a baby themselves, because there were many that hadn't, there were men in the group as well, that have not worked in the maternity space, and this is what they could come up with, then I think it really shows that they were listening. And that's the first thing I said in the press release, was I thanked them for really listening to women. And from the very beginning of the process, they wanted to. And so it talks about, I can't talk about what happened, but I can talk about the fact that it did happen, because it's mentioned in the report at the very beginning, before they even closed the submissions, before they even started their first hearing, they had an expert meeting where the select committee wanted to meet with experts, and so they asked, they had the head obstetrician from New South Wales Health, who'd been from what I was told, a really big supporter of birth centres and MGPs. So I thought, well, that was pretty cool. So he was there from the medical side. I was invited to talk about midwifery and the birth experience study, and then Athena, who was on your previous podcast, I put her name forward as a trauma-informed care specialist, because they really wanted someone who would understand trauma-informed care as well, to teach them. And it was a really interesting session to meet the team, to meet the committee, to talk about the different aspects that we wanted to talk about, and then have this panel at the end as well, where they could then ask us all these different questions. And they were so determined to make sure that the hearings were not going to re-traumatize women. And so they actually asked us as a panel, how can we do that? And so, like, Athena and I just asked them back, but, well, we've never been in one, so tell us what it's like. And they told us about all these different things, like the bright light shining on participants, or, the witnesses, and all the different factors. And we're like, all right, well, let's take that away, take that away, take that away, take that away. Can you do this? Can you do that? And gave them all these strategies, and they used them. And because if you were there in the hearings, you wouldn't know that they weren't there, because if you've never been to one, you wouldn't know what's missing, right? But so from the very beginning, I felt that select committee really wanted to listen to women, and they wanted to hear the answers from women. And that's the last thing I asked them to do. I got the last word in, and I said, just listen to women, because they've actually got the answers, especially if they've had a traumatic birth and then a healing birth next time. Find out what they did differently, because that is the key. Mm-hmm. And they went into it with that open mind, and they really did listen. And then they came up with these recommendations that I think there's so much gold in there. Obviously, they've got to be accepted and acted on. But my biggest fear was that they'd just miss what was being said. That they'd be swayed by politics, they'd be swayed by bigger voices, they'd be swayed by the outliers who are quite powerful. But they weren't. They were true to listening to women, and those recommendations are great.
Do you have an audience who would be interested in watching Birth Time the documentary? It doesn't matter if you have 1 follower or 100,000 followers across your social media or database. You can become a Birth Time Cicada affiliate. When you share the film, you'll receive 30% commission, and the people you forward it to will also enjoy a 20% discount to watch the film. On our own, it can be difficult to be heard, but together, we can be deafening. Let's rise together. You can find out all the info via our website at birthtime.world.
Where there's been, I guess, discourse around it not going far enough is Emma Hurst, who is the chair, who are a completely and utterly fangirl. Emma is, she wrote a bit at the end of the report of all the things that she felt it didn't go far enough or she didn't get good enough support for. And of course, media and other people, that's what they're going to pick up first, right? Oh, good, there's an argument that went on here. Let's focus in on that. Which is interesting, and it's useful to know the setup of what happened, and for transparency, because we said transparency is really important. So for transparency, it's fantastic, but picking up on all those negative type things can take away from all the richness of the recommendations that are in there. If we just even do a sneaky compare to the ones that came out of the UK, theirs kind of did not hit the mark compared to the ones that we got in ours. So, I know both as well, because I was a witness for the UK one too. So, okay, what did they involve? There were so many, there's 43 of them. But there's at the heart, it is that women need to get trauma-informed care, and midwives need to get, and maternity clinicians need to have care provided to them as well. That one I think is really important. So they actually highlighted that midwives and doctors and anyone in that maternity care space should also be getting debriefing and psychological support if they are experiencing and witnessing birth trauma. But for women, there is the continuity of care with a known provider. Now, Emma wanted that to say midwife, and the evidence says it should be a midwife. The next one down, though, does say to expand midwifery group practices across all local health districts. So they're really important things. They've listened to the evidence with that, and they've listened to what women have said. So I know from, one of your hashtags, or what you talk about in birth time is, one woman, one midwife. They're kind of saying that with the known provider without being able to really be able to say the midwife. That's one thing I wish they had got through, but Emma does explain how it didn't. But the next one down is let's push that midwifery group practice out to everyone. And also in that recommendation about pushing out MGP, it also says expanding the services they got, because I heard from a lot of women who said if you don't get onto it straight away, like the minute you pee on the stick, then you don't get a spot. So they're saying that those services need to be expanded as well. In the pregnancies period as well, they talk about the need for better education. And they didn't go down the line of this should all be about all the medical stuff that's going on. They're actually talking about there should be maybe not a standardized curriculum, but more guidelines around the education that women are getting, because it is so varied. And it's not equitable. Not everyone can get access to education. We can say that maybe with continuity of care, you don't need that because you're getting all that education as you go along. But I think there's still a place, I think, for community and education. Trying to think what other things are sitting up in the pregnancy world. But then one of the really powerful ones is putting the spotlight on interventions. That interventions should be evidence-based, which is interesting if we get into the topic of CTGs, but interventions should be evidence-based and should be used only when necessary. So they've linked women talking about the amount of interventions that they've had and how traumatizing they were to have. So that's a really important one. And obviously we can put induction of labour in that. I think we need to have a serious look at that.
But what happens now? So the Select Committee have put these recommendations forward to government. Who looks at that, and then how does it go about affecting change?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I will also add in there, it says that every woman should get a debrief and every woman should get that support, that there is a big focus on having culturally sensitive care for all women, which is really important, and accessing services and support for people from different groups, such as LGBTQI plus women, women with disabilities. So they did include a big diverse range of women and saying that they're not getting the care that they require at the moment. So a big push for that. And now, and I will also say there was a lot on grief and loss. So recognizing the women who've gone through losing a baby, whether that's through miscarriage or stillbirth, and maybe not being cared for in the right way. They're often that maybe being in a room next door to a new mum with a baby crying is not sensitive, is not really being well cared for. To be thinking about that, thinking about specific rooms that could be separate from maternity. And I think from a systems point of view, though, we've got to be careful that we don't then just shunt those women out of midwifery care, though, and into like a general ward where midwives are not working, because I do think midwives are the best experts to care for women who've gone through grief and loss. Nursing is a separate profession and they don't have the expert skills that we have in that field. So I don't want New South Wales Health just to think, oh, that's great, we'll just go put them in the gynecology ward instead. I want them to really be, they still need to be cared for under midwifery, I believe.
That's a good point, Hazel.
Yeah, so really having that kind of care and support for women who are going through grief and loss. And more support for women who have been told they've got congenital, their baby's got congenital abnormalities. They heard from women who, for example, women who'd been given a diagnosis of Down syndrome and had been constantly bullied to have a medical termination. And they didn't want to have one, but it was just an expectation that that's what you're going to do. And then all the way through to taking that baby home and being told by someone, oh, so you're going to keep the baby then. So really a lot more support on supporting women who are going to birth babies with congenital differences. These children are not abnormal. We shouldn't be using the term abnormalities. They just have differences. So that all came through as well. So what happens now is that the government does have 3 months to get back to the select committee to say what they're going to do with those findings. And what they've also written in is that there's got to be every 6 months, there's got to be like a check-in, basically, that the health minister has to kind of respond to them every 6 months to say how it's going. There was also recommendations on increased funding for research in that area. So that's really exciting in the research areas of birth trauma. So, it'd be great if New South Wales government puts some money there as well. But it'd be interesting to see really what happens next. I know that, there's a lot of people within the health service that were really happy with the recommendations. We're really excited by what change they could bring, especially the midwives, because they're like, wow, we're actually being recognised as a really core person in preventing this. And the fact that they highlighted that midwives need that support too. They need that debriefing and the professional support if needed. So, there was a lot of positive from the ground level, from the midwifery team. And now we need to see that coming through. One of the things that I don't really want to give them the airtime, to be honest, only because I think they missed the point, is a press release that did come out from our obstetric colleagues. And it was really quite disappointing because they were basically saying that, well, they don't agree with this midwifery being the lead because they believe in it should be multidisciplinary. And if we only focus on, but basically using the words that they're replacing obstetricians with midwives. Now, I don't know about you, Jo, but I've never wanted to do a caesarean. Like, it's just not my jam. I'm not interested in it. But I remember in an emergency when I was working in the hospital and the obstetrician needed a second because the doctor wasn't there, the other doctor wasn't there yet, and I was having to do the second part, it didn't interest me at all. And she thought that it was like my it was all my birthdays came at once. How lucky you are doing this. And I'm like, I'm not lucky. Just give me the baby. I want to go back to the mother and give them, I want to be at that. I'm not, this doesn't get me excited. They're not trying to replace. And by saying that they want the multidisciplinary team and that they're worried that midwives are replacing them, they continue to take away the core of what a midwife does, which is we don't work on our own. We work in a multidisciplinary way. We're trained to work in that way. In fact, all our thirds in our Bachelor of Midwifery have a whole subject called collaborative care. We don't have that in medicine. So we have a whole subject about how to be collaborative, how to work collaboratively. We don't want to be taken over and doing Caesareans, or, you know, what we want to be doing is supporting women and being that lead carer, because we know how to do that. We're very good at spotting when things are no longer within the realms of midwifery. We've got an entire document around it, which is the consultation referral guidelines. We know when we need to refer, but even when we refer, we know that we're the really good project managers at that point. That if there's a lot of complications, if a woman's got a lot of complications and needs to see lots of different people, that you can get lost in that system. And actually having your own midwife can help navigate that system and bring it all together so that she doesn't get lost. So we're not trying to replace you guys as obstetricians. We love you. We want to work with you. And we want to be able to refer to you in a good, timely manner where we're going to be respected. It's no replacement. You are amazing at high risk. You know, you're amazing at those surgical births. Don't want to do surgical births. Amazing at those complicated births when we need a bit more support. At the instrumental births, it does not interest me. But what interests me is that the woman comes out safe, well, and psychologically well, and that the baby comes out safe, well, and thriving. And if we need extra support for that to happen, we will ask for that. We're not midwifery at all costs. We're midwifery at no costs. We're cheaper. And we want to refer to you when we need to. So that statement that came out to say that they were not happy with the recommendations because they felt that you were replacing one profession with another was so far, and it was quite disrespectful, I think, on how multidisciplinary we are as midwives.
Absolutely.
Well put.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's a good place to end. However, we are asking everyone the same question as what we asked people in the film. And you may have actually already answered it in the last little bit, but let's go there because you might have something else to add. So what, in your opinion, would it take for all women to emerge from their births physically well and emotionally safe?
Well, I'll say the same thing that I said on the day of the release. And that is that we know from the survey and from my many years of working in maternity that women want and need culturally safe, trauma-informed, continuity of care with a midwife. And that is what will make them emerge as safe and thriving women who've gone through an amazing life change.
Thank you, Hazel Keedle.
Perfect.
Fabulous.
Thank you, love. One of our favourite birth smarty pantsers you are.
The clever clogs of birth.
Right?
And that's a wrap. You can check out the show notes to find websites, books, research articles, social media handles, and general information about each of our podcast guests. Thank you to our fabulous birth time sisters, Zoe Naylor and Selena Scoble, for supporting the creation of this podcast behind the scenes. If you're enjoying the show, please take a moment to follow or subscribe to Birth Time the podcast. Leave us a review and a rating, and please, we'd really love it if you'd share it amongst your friends and networks. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram at Birthtime World, and our website birthtime.world, where you can also stream and watch our international award-winning film, Birthtime the Documentary. You can find out more about me, Jo Hunter, and my midwifery work at midwifejo.com.au, and more about Jerusha Sutton and her gorgeous photography and doula work at jerusha.com.au. And thank you to you, our beautiful Birthtime family, for tuning in to Birthtime the podcast. We really do appreciate you all so, so much. Until next time.